On a Tuesday morning in October of 1969, Bobby Malone said something in the hallway of Harlan County High School that 31 people heard, and one person never forgot. That's where this story starts. Not with the job site, not with the mud and the machines and the money bleeding out at $20,000 a day while Bobby Malone stood on a blocked road in the rain watching everything he had built start to come apart. Not with the moment Bobby recognized the truck coming down the county road and understood, completely and without any possibility of misunderstanding, exactly what was about to happen to him. With a Tuesday morning in October, a 16-year-old boy with his father's money in his pocket and his father's confidence in his chest, and 31 witnesses who would remember what he said for the rest of their lives. Bobby Malone was the son of Gerald Malone, who owned Malone Construction, which was the largest privately held construction company in Harlan County, Kentucky. Gerald had built it over 20 years from a single bulldozer and a willingness to work longer hours than anyone who competed with him. He had done well. He had done well enough that Bobby had grown up in a house with 4 bedrooms and a truck in the driveway that was replaced every 2 years, and the particular kind of confidence that comes from never having had to wonder whether there would be enough. Bobby was 16 years old and he had his father's build and his father's directness, and none of his father's understanding that directness without judgment was just cruelty with better posture. Tommy Reese was also 16 years old. He had grown up on the other side of the county, on a property that his grandfather had farmed, and his father had partially converted to a wrecker yard when farming stopped paying enough to cover the taxes. Earl Reese ran Reese Recovery from a gravel lot on Campton Road with 2 trucks, one of which was a 1949 Holmes 480 that Earl had bought used in 1961, and maintained with the discipline of a man who understood that the truck was the difference between the family eating and the family not eating. Tommy had grown up in that yard the way boys grow up in family operations when there is no alternative. He had handed chain to his father on jobs when he was 9 years old. He had learned to read grades and surfaces and the way weight behaved on a descent before he learned to drive on a public road. He was not embarrassed by any of this. It was his life, and he understood it, and it had not occurred to him that it was something to be embarrassed about until the Tuesday morning in October of 1969, when Bobby Malone enlightened him on the subject in front of 31 witnesses. The occasion was nothing, a hallway, between classes, the particular social geometry of a high school corridor where certain boys occupied the center and other boys occupied the edges, and the distance between the two was not measured in feet, but in something more durable and more cruel. Tommy had been walking past. Bobby had been standing with 4 other boys, the ones who stood with Bobby, because standing with Bobby meant standing at the center. Bobby had looked at Tommy. He had said it loud enough for everyone in that hallway to hear. "Your daddy drives a tow truck," Bobby said, "pulls people out of ditches for a living." He said it with the smile of someone who has identified a fact that he considers amusing. You know what that makes him. He let the pause do its work. "A glorified garbage man," Bobby said, "and you know what that makes you." He looked at the boys around him. They were already smiling because Bobby was smiling, and that was how it worked in that hallway. "It makes you the garbage man, son," Bobby said, "and that's all you're ever going to be. Your daddy pulls trucks out of ditches, and you're going to pull trucks out of ditches, and that's the whole story of the Reese family right there." He shrugged, like it was just an observation, like he was simply reporting a fact he found mildly interesting. Tommy stopped walking. He looked at Bobby. He did not say anything. He stood there for a moment with 31 people watching him, and then he turned and walked to his next class and sat down and opened his book, and did not think about Bobby Malone for the rest of that day, because Bobby Malone had not earned the thinking. That was October of 1969. The next time Tommy Reese and Bobby Malone were in the same place at the same time was April of 1983, 14 years later. On a job site outside Harlan, where the ground had opened up under Bobby Malone's most expensive piece of equipment and swallowed it, and where Bobby Malone was standing in the rain watching $200,000 sink into the earth while the clock ran and the contract penalties accumulated, and the men he had called for help told him one by one that there was nothing they could do. Tommy was 30 years old by then and had been running Reese Recovery since his father's back gave out in 1978. He had the Holmes. He had his father's knowledge. He had 14 years of Harlan County roads and hollows and the specific education that comes from working terrain that defeats equipment which was not built for it. He had not thought about Bobby Malone in a long time. Bobby had come back to him 3 days before the job site, in the way that things come back when you are not expecting them. When someone at the parts store mentioned Malone Construction, and the name had surfaced from wherever Tommy had put it, and he had thought about that hallway for the first time in years, and then put it back where it came from. He had not thought about it again until he saw the job site from the county road and pulled over to look and understood what he was looking at. Let me tell you about Bobby Malone in the years between 1969 and 1983. Because to understand the job site, you have to understand the man standing in front of it. Bobby had gone to the University of Kentucky on his father's money and had studied business, because that was what men who were going to run their father's company studied. He had come back to Harlan County in 1975 with a degree and an understanding of finance that Gerald Malone had not possessed, and had spent the following 8 years turning Malone Construction from a large local company into the dominant construction operation in 3 counties. He had done this through genuine intelligence, which he had, and through a willingness to take on debt that his father would not have taken on, and through a talent for winning contracts that came partly from knowing how to price a bid and partly from knowing which relationships to cultivate and how. By 1983, Malone Construction employed 90 men. It had equipment worth more than $2 million. It had contracts with the State Highway Department, 2 county governments, and a coal company that had been expanding its surface operations and needed roads built faster than its own crews could build them. Bobby drove a new truck, changed it every year. He wore clothes to job sites that most of the men on his payroll could not have afforded for church. He had his father's directness, and he had acquired over the years a polish on top of it that made it harder to see but did not make it less. He had not thought about Tommy Reese in 14 years either. The job site that was destroying him in April of 1983 was a road project for the coal company. A haul road through a hollow on the north side of the county, 6 miles of graded surface that needed to be built to a specification that would support loaded coal trucks running 3 shifts. Bobby had bid it tight to win it, and he was running the project himself because the contract penalties for delay were severe enough that he did not trust anyone else to manage the timeline. The problem had appeared on the 3rd day of the 2nd week. A section of the hollow floor that the survey had characterized as stable ground, and that had appeared stable under the preliminary equipment, had turned out to be stable only until a Caterpillar 375 excavator, 60 tons of steel and hydraulic systems, had parked on it for 4 hours. The ground had given way over the course of about 90 minutes, not catastrophically, slowly and then completely. The excavator had settled into the hollow floor at a rate that was alarming but not immediately dangerous, and by the time Bobby's site foreman understood what was happening, the machine was into its tracks and still settling. The operator had gotten out. That was the first thing that mattered. He had climbed through the cab window when the angle got bad and had walked out of the hollow with mud to his thighs, and the look of a man who had just understood something important about the ground he had been sitting on. The machine was another matter. The Caterpillar 375 had cost $380,000. It was 18 months old. It was now sitting in what the hollow floor had become, which was effectively a saturated clay basin 8 feet deep with the consistency of cold porridge, with its tracks invisible and its cab door at approximately knee height above the surface. Bobby had called his equipment company in Lexington. They had sent a recovery crew with a heavy hydraulic rig that had assessed the ground conditions and determined that any vehicle heavy enough to recover the excavator would sink into the same material before it could reach the machine. They had recommended ground stabilization, which would take 3 weeks and cost more than the machine was worth to attempt. Bobby had called a recovery company in Middlesboro. They had come out and said the same thing in different words. He had called a company in Pikeville that specialized in mine equipment recovery. They had sent an engineer who had spent 2 hours on site and produced a written assessment that said the hollow floor's load-bearing capacity had been compromised across an area of approximately 40 feet in every direction from the excavator, and that any attempt to approach with heavy equipment without prior stabilization would result in the loss of the recovery vehicle as well. It was the 3rd day of trying to solve this problem. Bobby was standing at the edge of the hollow in the April rain, looking at his Caterpillar 375 sitting in the earth like a monument to miscalculation, and calculating what the delay was costing him, and coming up with numbers that he did not want to look at directly. That's when he heard the truck on the county road. Tommy had been on his way to a job on the other side of the county. A farmer's tractor had gone into a creek off a hollow road the previous evening. Standard work, the kind of job that did not require anything except showing up and doing it. He had come around the bend on the county road and seen the Malone construction trucks parked at the hollow entrance, and the men standing around in the rain, and the general posture of a job site where something has gone wrong and stayed wrong long enough that everyone has stopped pretending it is going to fix itself. He had slowed down because he had been slowing down at situations like this for 12 years, and because slowing down was how you found out whether you could help. He had looked at the hollow entrance. He had looked at the tracks in the mud that told him what kind of equipment had come in and what direction it had gone and roughly what had happened after that. He had looked at the geography of the hollow, the way it sat in the landscape, where the water went when it rained, what the drainage pattern said about what the ground underneath was likely to be. He had pulled over and gotten out. He had walked to the hollow entrance and stood there looking in. The Caterpillar 375 was visible 60 feet into the hollow, sitting in the surface at cab height. The mud around it was dark and had the particular sheen of material that was still moving, still settling, still finding its level. Tommy looked at it for a while. He looked at the hollow walls. He looked at the timber on the slopes above the hollow, at the root systems visible where the banks had been cut, at what the exposed strata told him about the hollow floor's composition. He looked at the old fence line running along the east slope of the hollow, the posts set into solid ground 15 feet above the hollow floor, the wire still strung between them, the corner posts anchored into what looked like bedrock at the hollow's upper end. He had a plan in less than 3 minutes. He walked back to the county road. Bobby Malone was standing at his truck talking on the radio. He saw Tommy walking toward him from the hollow entrance. He looked at Tommy with the expression of a man who does not recognize someone he should recognize. Tommy stopped in front of him. "I can get your machine out," Tommy said. Bobby looked at him. He looked at the Holmes 480 parked on the road shoulder behind Tommy, the dark paint, the worn boom, the chain drum, the truck that looked like it had been on Harlan County roads since before Bobby was born. Bobby looked back at Tommy. "Who are you?" Bobby said. Tommy looked at him. Something moved across Bobby's face. A recognition that was not quite recognition yet. A sense of a face that belonged to a context he could not immediately locate. "Reese," Tommy said. "Reese Recovery, Campton Road." Bobby looked at him for another moment. Then it arrived. The hallway, October of 1969, the 31 witnesses, the garbage man's son. Bobby's expression did not change in any way that Tommy could have described if asked, but something behind it changed. "You're Earl Reese's boy," Bobby said. "That's right." Bobby looked at the Holmes 480. "3 companies have assessed that site," Bobby said. "A crew from Lexington, a company from Middlesboro, an engineer from Pikeville. All 3 said the ground conditions make recovery impossible without prior stabilization." He paused. "That rig of yours looks like it's from about 1949. 1949, Tommy said. "It's a Holmes 480. My father bought it in 1961. Bobby looked at him. He looked at the hollow. He looked at the caterpillar sitting in the mud 60 feet in. "What makes you think you can do what 3 professional operations said can't be done?" Bobby said. Tommy looked at the hollow entrance. "Because they were all trying to drive to it," Tommy said. "I'm not going to drive to it." Bobby waited. Tommy nodded toward the east slope of the hollow. "That fence line up there, the corner posts, what are they anchored into?" Bobby looked at the fence line. He had not looked at the fence line. "I don't know," Bobby said. "Looks like bedrock from here," Tommy said. "If it is, I can anchor to those posts and run chain down the slope into the hollow and to your machine without putting any weight on the hollow floor at all. Pull it out from the side instead of from the front. The angle won't be perfect, but it doesn't need to be perfect. It just needs to be good enough to break the suction and start the machine moving." Bobby looked at the fence line. He looked at the caterpillar. He looked at Tommy. "3 companies said it can't be done," Bobby said again. Tommy looked at him. "They had bigger equipment," Tommy said. "More capacity on paper, but capacity doesn't help you when you can't get close enough to use it." He paused. "My rig weighs 12 tons. The Lexington crew's rig weighed 40. He nodded at the hollow floor. "You saw what 60 tons did to that ground. What do you think 40 would have done?" Bobby was quiet for a moment. Tommy let him be quiet. "If it doesn't work," Bobby said finally, "you've wasted your morning." Tommy looked at the hollow. "I've wasted mornings before," he said. "Let me tell you about the setup, because that's where 12 years of hollow work showed itself." Tommy spent 40 minutes on the east slope of the hollow before he ran a foot of chain. He dug around 2 of the corner fence posts with a bar he carried in the Holmes and confirmed what the root exposure on the bank had suggested. Both posts were set into a limestone shelf that ran along the upper edge of the hollow. Solid. The kind of solid that had been there since before the hollow was cut, and would be there after everything built on the hollow floor was gone. He drove 2 additional anchor stakes into the limestone shelf alongside the fence posts, using a hammer drill he had built a mount for on the Holmes's rear bumper, sinking the stakes 12 inches into stone, and testing each one with his body weight before he trusted it with anything else. He rigged a 4-part block and tackle between the anchor stakes and a redirect sheave. He mounted to a tree 40 feet further down the slope, creating a mechanical advantage system that would multiply his pulling force while keeping the Holmes on solid ground at the hollow entrance. Then he ran chain, 420 feet of it, down the east slope, across the 15 feet of solid ground at the hollow margin, and into the mud toward the caterpillar. He waded into the mud at the hollow's edge, up to his knees, to reach the attachment point he had selected on the excavator's main frame rail. Bobby's site foreman watched him wade into the mud without hesitation, and hooked the chain to the frame and wade back out. The foreman walked over to where Bobby was standing. "He's done this before," the foreman said. Bobby watched Tommy climb the slope back to the Holmes. "I know," Bobby said. Tommy engaged the first drum at 2:15 in the afternoon. The chain system ran from the Holmes's drum down the slope, through the block and tackle, through the redirect sheave, across the solid margin, and into the mud to the caterpillar's frame rail. The mechanical advantage was multiplying the Holmes's pulling force by a factor of 4. What arrived at the caterpillar's frame was not 12 tons. It was closer to 48. Applied slowly, applied from an angle, applied without any weight on the hollow floor. The drum turned. The chain loaded. The block and tackle took the strain and redistributed it across 4 lines. The anchor stakes in the limestone shelf held without movement. Bobby stood at the hollow entrance in the rain and watched. His site foreman stood beside him. Neither spoke. For the first 2 minutes, nothing visible happened at the surface of the mud around the caterpillar. Then the mud near the machine's left track moved. Not much. A ripple. The kind of movement that happens when something large and heavy shifts position in saturated material. The foreman made a sound. Bobby said nothing. The chain system was pulling the caterpillar not straight out, which would have required breaking the full suction of 60 tons of steel against 8 feet of saturated clay, but at a diagonal, working with the natural slip plane of the material, coaxing the machine to rotate slightly around its center of gravity before the main extraction began. This was not something Tommy had explained to Bobby. It was not something Bobby would have understood if Tommy had explained it. It was the product of 12 years of watching his father work hollow jobs, and then 12 more years of working them himself, and developing an understanding of how saturated clay behaved under load that no engineering text had ever described to him, because the engineers who wrote the texts had not spent 24 years in Harlan County hollows. The caterpillar rotated. 2 degrees, 3. The left track coming up slightly from the mud, the suction breaking on that side, the material releasing its grip at one point and then another. The foreman grabbed Bobby's arm, not dramatically, the involuntary grip of a man watching something he did not expect to see. 5 degrees. The machine was moving, still in the mud, still surrounded by it, but moving through it rather than being held by it, the rotation carrying it toward the slope where Tommy's chain was pulling. 10 degrees, 15. The left track broke the surface. It came up dripping, mud sheeting off the steel, the grouser bars emerging black and heavy from the hollow floor. The track was on the solid margin now, on the narrow strip of ground that had not failed because it was underlain by the same limestone shelf that Tommy's anchor stakes were set in. Bobby did not move. He was watching the machine the way a man watches something he has been told cannot happen and is happening anyway. 20 degrees. The caterpillar was on the margin now, both tracks on solid ground, still leaning at an angle toward the hollow floor but no longer in it, no longer being held by it. Tommy kept the drum turning. He pulled the machine another 30 feet along the margin toward the hollow entrance, keeping it on solid ground, until it was close enough to the entrance that Bobby's own equipment could reach it from the county road. Then he disengaged the PTO. The drum stopped, the chain went slack. Tommy sat in the Holmes for a moment. Then he got out and walked down the slope to where Bobby was standing. Bobby looked at the caterpillar sitting at the hollow entrance on solid ground, covered in mud but intact, both tracks down, cab accessible. He looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at Tommy. Tommy was muddy to the thigh from wadding to the attachment point. His work coat was wet from the rain. He looked like a man who had done a morning's work and was ready to go do the afternoons. Bobby opened his mouth, closed it. He tried again. 3 companies, Bobby said. 3 professional operations said that couldn't be done. Tommy looked at him. They were trying to solve the wrong problem, Tommy said. They were trying to get equipment to the machine. I was trying to get the machine to the equipment. Bobby looked at the block and tackle system still rigged on the east slope. He looked at the anchor stakes in the limestone. He looked at the chain running down the slope. The fence posts, Bobby said. You saw the fence posts from the road. I saw the bank exposure on the east slope, Tommy said. The fence posts confirmed it. Bobby looked at him. Tommy looked back. There was a long moment. The rain was still coming down. The hollow was still. the mud surface settling slowly back to level where the caterpillar had been. Bobby said something that he had been working toward for a long time, longer than the 3 days of the job site, longer than the morning of watching. Tommy set up the anchor system and run the chain. He said it not the way men say things they have rehearsed, but the way men say things they have needed to say, and finally found themselves in a position where not saying them was no longer possible. 1969, Bobby said, the hallway at Harlan County High, what I said about your father. Tommy waited. I was 16 years old and I was an idiot, Bobby said. That's the only explanation I have, and I know it's not enough. Tommy looked at him for a moment. He had thought about what he would say if this moment ever came. He had thought about it a few times over the years, not often, but a few times, in the way you think about things that were done to you publicly and that you never had the chance to answer. He had imagined several versions of what he would say. Some of them were satisfying in the imagining. None of them was what he actually said. What he said was this. Your machine is out of the hollow, Tommy said. That's what I came here to do. He turned and walked back up the slope to begin breaking down the anchor system. Bobby Malone stood at the hollow entrance and watched him go. His site foreman was standing nearby, close enough to have heard everything, far enough to be looking at the caterpillar rather than at the two men. After a moment, the foreman walked over to Bobby. He didn't say much, the foreman said, for a man who had every right to say a lot more. Bobby watched Tommy working on the east slope. No, Bobby said, he didn't. Bobby paid the invoice 3 days later. He paid it at twice the rate Tommy had listed, which was already a fair rate, and he included a letter that his secretary typed, and he rewrote by hand because the typed version had not said what he meant. The letter said that Malone Construction would be referring all recovery work in Harlan County to Reese Recovery on Campton Road, effective immediately, and that this referral was not a business arrangement, but a debt that Bobby intended to acknowledge in whatever way he could for as long as he was in a position to do so. Tommy read the letter once. He put it in the drawer in the office. He called Malone Construction the following week and spoke to Bobby's project manager and said that Reese Recovery was available for Malone's work on the same terms as any other customer, and that he appreciated the referral but did not need the explanation that came with it. The project manager passed this along. Bobby sat with it for a few days. Then he called Tommy directly. I owe you more than an invoice, Bobby said. Tommy was quiet for a moment. You don't owe me anything, Tommy said. The invoice was for the job. The job is done. Bobby was quiet. That hallway, Tommy said finally. I thought about it for about a week after it happened. Then I decided it wasn't worth any more of my time than that. I've got a lot of things that are worth my time. Bobby Malone at 16 years old is not one of them. Bobby did not say anything for a moment. Then he said the only thing that seemed adequate. Your father, Bobby said, Earl Reese, is he still in the county? He's in hiding, Tommy said, retired his back. Bobby was quiet. He built something, Bobby said. Your father, that operation, that knowledge. He built something real and he passed it to you, and what I said in that hallway was wrong about all of it. Tommy held the phone. Yes, Tommy said, it was. Tommy Reese ran the yard on Campton Road until 2004. He expanded twice, modestly, in ways that kept the operation manageable and kept him doing the work he understood rather than managing work he had delegated. He added a second truck in 1989, a used unit that he rebuilt over the winter in the same way his father had rebuilt the Holmes. The Holmes itself ran until 1997. Tommy retired it when the cab floor rusted through in a way that he could not repair without a fabrication capability he did not have, and when the parts situation became difficult enough that he could no longer guarantee its reliability. He kept it in the back of the yard under a canvas cover. He started it once a month for the first 3 years, and then once a season, and then on the anniversaries of jobs that he remembered. The block and tackle system from the Malone Hollow job is still in the back of the yard. Tommy never saw any reason to disassemble it. It is the same system he has used on 6 other hollow jobs in 20 years, modified slightly each time, adjusted for what each job taught him. Bobby Malone sent work to Reese Recovery for 22 years, not exclusively. Bobby was a practical man, and he used whichever operator made sense for a given job. But the complicated jobs, the ones with bad ground and wrong angles and the kind of conditions that made standard approaches useless, those jobs went to Tommy. Tommy never turned one down. They were not friends in the way that men who share history and temperament become friends. They were something else. 2 men who had grown up in the same county and had been on opposite sides of something and had come through it and found themselves on terms that were not warm but were honest and had the particular durability of things that have been tested. Bobby sold Malone Construction in 2001 when his health began to cause him problems that the doctors said would not resolve themselves. He sold it to a younger man who had been running his projects for a decade and who kept the company's name and most of its practices. He called Tommy the day the sale closed. "I wanted you to know," Bobby said, "before you heard it somewhere else." Tommy thanked him. Bobby was quiet for a moment. "That hollow," Bobby said, April of '83. "I've thought about it a lot over the years. Not just what you did with the chain and the anchor stakes, what you said after, when I brought up the hallway." Tommy waited. "You said you'd thought about it for a week and then decided it wasn't worth any more of your time," Bobby said. "I've thought about that for 20 years, about what it takes to be that kind of person." Tommy was quiet. "My father was that kind of person," Tommy said. Bobby was quiet for a moment. "I know," Bobby said. "I know he was. That's what I was wrong about in that hallway. That's what I've never been able to entirely forgive myself for. Not what I said about you. What I said about him." Tommy held the phone. He thought about his father, about the yard on Campton Road in the mornings when the mist was still on the hollow above the property, about the Holmes 480 and the chain on the drum, and the jobs that his father had taught him by showing him rather than explaining, because showing was the only way the important things could be taught. He thought about October of 1969 and what his father would have said if Tommy had come home and told him what had happened in that hallway. He knew exactly what his father would have said. Earl Reese would have listened to the whole thing and then looked at his son and said something that Tommy had heard him say about difficult people and difficult situations his entire childhood. "Let the work answer," Earl used to say. "The work always answers." Tommy had let the work answer in April of 1983 in a hollow in Harlan County with 420 feet of chain, and an anchor stake in a limestone shelf, and a block and tackle system, rigged on a slope that a 16-year-old boy in a school hallway could not have imagined and could not have built and could not have used. The work had answered. It was enough. Tommy said, "Your machine came out of that hollow. That's the whole story. Everything else is just the years around it." Bobby was quiet for a long time. "Yeah," Bobby said finally. "Yeah, I suppose it is." Earl Reese died in 2003. He was 81 years old and had been in hiding for 12 years, living with Tommy's sister, his back having taken him off the work he had loved before it was ready to let him go. Tommy drove to Hyde in the morning his father died and sat with him for a while, and then drove back to Harlan County on the roads his father had taught him. He drove them at the speed they required. He had learned that from Earl. The speed that roads required was not always the speed you wanted to travel. Bobby Malone sent flowers to the funeral home. He did not attend because his health had declined enough by then that the drive was not something he could manage. He called Tommy the evening of the funeral. "Your father," Bobby said. "I only knew him from a distance, but I knew what he built on Campton Road, and I knew who you are, and I understand that one of those things came from the other." Tommy held the phone. "He built everything that mattered," Tommy said. "I just kept it running." Bobby was quiet. "That's not nothing," Bobby said. "Keeping something running that someone else built, that takes its own kind of person." Tommy looked out the window of the office on Campton Road at the yard in the evening light. The Holmes 480 was visible under the canvas in the back, the outline of the boom against the canvas. The newer truck was parked in its usual spot. The block and tackle from the Malone Hollow job was on the rack in the corner of the garage. "My father used to say something," Tommy said. "When a job was done, when the machine was out and the chain was coiled and everything was back in the truck, he'd look at whatever it was we just pulled out and he'd say the same thing every time." Bobby waited. "There it is," Tommy said. "Just that. There it is." Like the machine being on solid ground was the only thing that needed to be said about the whole situation. Bobby was quiet for a moment. "There it is," Bobby said. "Yeah," Tommy said, "there it is. The yard on Campton Road is still there. Tommy's daughter Sarah runs it now. She came into the operation in her late 20s after a career in civil engineering that had been good and had not, in the end, been what she needed. She had grown up watching her father work the way Tommy had grown up watching Earl, and when she came back to the yard, she brought an engineer's understanding of load and geometry and soil mechanics, and laid it on top of a lifetime of watching the chain do what chain does on Harlan County roads. She kept the Holmes 480. It is in the back of the garage under a canvas tarp that she pulls back once a month to start the engine. The drum still turns. The chain has been replaced 3 times since 1949. The drum has not. The block and tackle from the Malone Hollow job is on the rack in the corner of the second bay. Sarah has used it twice. Both times the hollow floor was bad and the standard approach was wrong, and the solution was the same one Tommy had built for the Malone job in 1983, which was the same solution Earl had first sketched out in his head on a job in 1971 that Tommy had been there to watch. Some solutions travel through families. Not because families sit down and teach them, because the right person is in the right place at the right time, watching the right man figure out the answer, and because watching is how the things that cannot be written down get passed along. Bobby Malone died in 2007. His son called Tommy the day after. They had never met, but the son knew who Tommy was because Bobby had talked about the hollow job in the way that people talk about the things that changed how they understood something. "He told me the story a dozen times," Bobby's son said. "The fence posts and the limestone shelf and the chain coming down the slope. He said you could see the hollow floor from the county road, and you stopped and looked and you knew." Tommy was quiet for a moment. "I saw the bank exposure," Tommy said, "on the east slope, the root systems in the exposed face. That told me what the shelf was probably doing underneath." Bobby's son was quiet. "He said you didn't say anything about 1969, Bobby's son said. "When he brought it up, after the job, he said you told him it wasn't worth any more of your time than the week you'd already given it." Tommy looked out the office window at the yard. "It wasn't," Tommy said. "Your father was 16 years old. I was 16 years old. We were both different people than we turned out to be. He turned out better than he started. That's all you can ask of anybody." Bobby's son was quiet for a long time. Then he said something that Tommy wrote down on the notepad on the office desk, and that Sarah found after Tommy died and had framed and put on the wall of the office above the desk where Tommy had written it. He said, "My father told me that the most important thing he ever learned in business he learned in a hollow in Harlan County from a man whose father he had insulted when they were boys. He learned that the size of your equipment is not the measure of your capability, and that some men see things in the ground that other men will never see no matter how long they look." He said my father never forgot standing at that hollow entrance watching the chain come down the slope. He said it was the first time in his life he understood that he had been wrong about something that actually mattered. Tommy held the phone. He thought about Earl Reese at the end of a job, standing at the hollow entrance or the creek bank or the ditch edge, looking at whatever had just come out of wherever it had been. The particular stillness of a man who has done what he came to do. "There it is," Tommy said quietly. He wasn't sure Bobby's son could hear him. "It didn't matter. There it is."